Welcome to Lesson 4 in our Counseling module. This is a 3-slide presentation and should be about medium length. One of the most important things for us to think about when we go into this business of using counseling skills are the ethics behind it. It's very, very powerful stuff, and if not handled carefully, you can actually cause some harm to people. So I want us to focus on a couple of ideas in this video. First of all, a really careful examination of some specific ethical considerations, as well as taking a look at how self-evaluation matters before we ever sit down with somebody. And this is really an important video for you as you prepare for your self-evaluation assignment. So the first of the key ethical considerations is the notion of competency. There will be times when you sit down with somebody and they self-disclose or reveal to you that something that's happening for them is pretty heavy duty. Maybe they are suicidal, or maybe they start describing really intensive trauma, such as sexual abuse. When that happens to you and you recognize that you're in an area with somebody that is far beyond your ability to give some counseling type support, you need to make sure that you are getting that person connected to somebody who does possess the experience and expertise and qualifications to be a counselor. Do that in consultation with your supervisor or other senior members of your team. If you're in a school, that means your principal or the counselors within the school, and help to bring those people in or to make referrals. An even better approach is something I call navigation. And here's the difference. Imagine that you come to me and you say, Paul, I've been having lots of conflict with my husband. Do you know any good marital counselors? And I give you a list of people and say, here's some phone numbers and email addresses. That's referral. And as you might imagine, a lot of people will take that list and do very little with it, at least not for quite some time. In navigation, I would go a much further step. I might say something like, well, why don't I go with you down the hallway to go and meet somebody like in Riverside, Barb Iverson, our youth care worker, and maybe she'll be able to help you and I can make an introduction. Or maybe she will have somebody that she has a personal relationship with that she can recommend. Maybe I'll phone somebody and ask them to give you a call, or I'll just be with you waiting in the waiting room for somebody. This idea of literally going with people as a navigator or as a facilitator can be a huge difference in whether or not a person feels comfortable tackling counseling or any kind of therapy. And so you may listen to people using some of your counseling skills, but arrive at the conclusion fairly early on that your best step is to help a person not only find other more experienced help, but to go with them or navigate with them, or whoever else might be a person to bring into that navigational process to help them be as comfortable as possible at getting the help they need. Next is confidentiality. And one of the things that will often happen is that a person will sit down with you and they'll say something like, I have something I want to tell you, but I'm not sure I should. Do you promise not to tell anybody else if I tell you? And it's a really challenging scenario to be in, at least on the surface of things. But my experience is that people genuinely want to tell you this thing. That's why they are kind of approaching the subject. Be absolutely clear. The answer to the question, will you keep it private, if the person tells you something that is really concerning or serious, the answer to that is no. You're not allowed to, and it would be highly unsafe to do that. So here you have an obligation to reveal to people what you would do. But I think there's a big difference between saying, no, I can't do that, and saying, here's what will happen if you tell me something that causes me concern. I will go with you to find other help. I will tell you what I intend to do. I will make sure that it's somebody or something that includes what I think you care about, what makes you feel as comfortable as possible. And sometimes people will say, at least in the moment, I don't want to tell you then, but it's rare when that happens. And they often will come back later on, even if they do that. Even if the person doesn't tell you anything, they have certainly given you a flag. And at that point, I would already go and get help from a senior person, like a principal or a counselor or my supervisor. I would go and find out from those people what they thought I might do as next steps. And one thing they might recommend is that they or somebody else that person trusts might reach out to the student or to the supported person. All right. The next one is the law and safety. Sometimes people will disclose to you things that they are doing that are unsafe or illegal. And this is a bit of a challenging one for us. For example, what if a 17-year-old child tells you that they are smoking marijuana? Is it a big enough thing to reveal to other people? The answer is, generally speaking, if it's a youth, the answer is yes, because that drug use or that premature sexual activity and so forth, I want to at least go to my supervisor. Now, that doesn't mean I immediately call up the family. That's something I want you to avoid doing. Get expert input from your supervisor or principal before you go revealing that information. And certainly, just immediately calling the police is something we would need to be careful about as well. But there are lots of times when people will tell you they've done something and it would be counterproductive to involve the authorities. And that's why I want you to be careful with this. For example, if a person tells you that they once shoplifted, or if they tell you that they sped on the way to their appointment, or they tell you that they used cocaine a week ago, especially for adults, those are not scenarios where I immediately pick up the telephone. Where I do know it's very likely I'll need to involve the police is if a person is telling you they intend to cause harm to themselves or to others. For example, suicidality, or if they are plotting or telling you that they're going to go and do something to their spouse or to another professional. And I would act on those promptly. I would document with as much detail as I could what the person said, and I would go to my supervisor and to the authorities quickly if I had any concern about the immediate safety of the individual or of anybody else. Okay, so that's a critical one. And accountability, really making sure that the person understands who you are, what your role is, and what you can and cannot do is really important, including the avenues of recourse. Where do they go if they don't feel like they are getting what they need from you, or if they feel offended by something that you've done? And it might seem odd, but it's really more comforting for people if you tell them at the beginning, hey, here's how you can reach out to others if you feel like you need to. But really, it can be a challenging process to tell people these expectations and role, and I don't think it's legitimate or realistic to expect to always get that done in one conversation. Often takes giving people something they can go off and review, checking people for understanding, and having multiple conversations, or even bringing in kind of aides. One of the most important things for us, therefore, if we're going to be ethical, is to be as self-aware as we can, both about our values as well as our interpersonal styles. Because when you think about it, this is a really powerful, almost mystically powerful process. But it doesn't involve anything more sophisticated than two people sitting down and talking. And whenever that happens, the perceptions of both of those people are in the room. We unknowingly sometimes bring in a host of biases. Maybe they're racial prejudices or gender biases. Maybe they are feelings about trauma that we want to avoid. And anytime somebody brings up something that reminds us of that, we tend to want to change the subject. There are many ways that our perceptions can affect how we respond. Our perception of what it means to be a helper, or what help means, are examples of this. And so really getting I call to a point of heartbreaking honesty is incredibly valuable. Let me give you one example. I often have students who are 19 and 20 years old who sit down in role plays and start to give advice to people. And that always struck me as a bit of an odd thing, because if you think about it, at 19 and 20 years old, you're just beginning your adulthood. Chances are you don't have children, you don't own a home, you haven't worked in any kind of career for a long period of time, and so your ability to give advice is probably based on some bias and not on evidence. That's just one example. Another example is somebody who gives advice about drug and alcohol recovery without stopping and thinking about the fact that maybe for them the journey through their own recovery was many years long. Or maybe they didn't have a drug and alcohol recovery journey and can't relate specifically, but they aren't very good at controlling something like their food consumption. So we need to really check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, is something I like to say. And being really honest with ourselves is hard work. It takes lots of work. It takes lots of time alone. And it can also be really constructive to have something I call a critical friend, or more than one in your life. Somebody who you love well enough and trust well enough to allow them to tell you when you're not doing your best, when you're not as sharp as you could be, and actually seeking that person out. Your role is often to help the other person to recognize their own perceptions, so you need to be able to delineate the difference between what you think they're saying and their perceptions and your own perceptions, and that takes practice. Doing an inventory allows you to sit and think about the best styles in your repertoire and to work on those that you aren't yet strong enough at, to avoid being judgmental, which is a very common pitfall, and to avoid burning out by taking things personally or accepting an unrealistic amount of responsibility or having unrealistic expectations about how long things take. We all go in with what people in the 60s called our hang-ups, little things. So for example, a person might show up at your meeting 2 minutes late, and if that's a real hang-up for you, you might let it affect the spirit you bring to the entire conversation, even though it might have been nothing more significant than the bus broke down on the way to the appointment. So we really want to think about those kinds of things, and the reading in the first part of the self-awareness assignment and the questions around beliefs and values, thoughts, actions, ethics, and feelings, that model, that self-awareness model, is a bit hard for people at first, but being really conversant at each of those 6 things and understanding the difference between them is a powerful, powerful tool. And once you get it, it really tends to make a difference in the work we do. In her book, Jacqueline Small talks about a couple of things: potency and self-actualization. So potency she doesn't, in my opinion, do a great job of explaining this, but potency can basically be described as poise or confidence, that feeling that somebody else gets when they're with somebody who really kind of seems to have their stuff together. And as a counselor, we have to do that. There has to be some substance to it, which we'll get to in a moment. But you have to have a sense of presence. If you look nervous or uncertain of yourself, then the other person will not feel comfortable. I use the metaphor of getting on a bus and having a bus driver who seems really nervous. Nobody wants to get on that bus. But if the bus driver just seems calm, cool, collected, you may not ever know that that was the first day of driving that bus for that bus driver, but you're going to probably feel comfortable. So it takes practice. It literally takes standing in a mirror and talking to people and just trying different things out to see what you look like and feel like. Review yourself on videotape. Ask people how you came across. So it's about looking the part. One has to appear in command of oneself so that that's attractive to the person in need. They have to demonstrate confidence as opposed to being in a presence that suggests insecurity. But that should be more than just an appearance, which is why self-actualization really matters. All those personal growth exercises that we have been doing and will continue to do are part of that. One of the things I love about this work is that it has demanded of me that I continuously try to be as good a person, as complete and well of a person as I possibly can be, so that I'm an authentic, real force when I'm talking to people. If I come before you as a teacher and I tell you to do things that I would never do, I think you can tell. As a counselor, if I tell you I care about you, but I don't really evoke that, then I think you can tell. So this idea of genuineness has to be rooted in the idea that we're getting pretty good at living this thing called life. And that's what self-actualization is. It's really about reaching your highest potential, really being a whole, happy, complete person. So it's one of the hardest things to achieve. It's going to be a lifelong journey, and you have to be forgiving of the fact that it doesn't happen always on an upscale, on an uphill increase. There are, just like a stock market chart, there are going to be times in your life when you are in a bit of a tailspin. Everybody has them. Some of the tools for this are to constantly involve yourself in self-assessment. That's why we do so much of that work in this class. What am I good at? Where do I need to improve? What are my resources? And what specifically am I going to work on? And just like we learned in our planning module, We have to pick a realistic number of goals. I strongly believe in the idea that we should not expect to be involved in the planning of other people if we can't do it for ourselves. So engage in that same process of thinking about your goals and how well you're achieving them and picking new goals. Think about the resources and assets in your life. Think about the needs in your life. Work on being somebody who is comfortable with yourself and accepting of yourself. Nobody's perfect, but if you go in the mirror and all you see is that wrinkle that you don't like, or that mole that you don't like, or that little bit of fat that you don't like, then you're really missing the 99.99% of yourself that everybody else actually sees, the part that's really valuable. So work on being comfortable with yourself, and that will translate to other people. Really dig into the true desire to help. If we're there to help because it's the only way we feel good about ourselves, that doesn't look very good to other people. That kind of comes across as self-centered. But if you truly find joy in seeing other people feel well, then that is going to be its own reward, and people will tell that you're authentically there with them. Have value for the process. Really enjoy the idea of doing an activity as opposed to the outcome of the activity. I think of it like kids doing Lego. It was never, when we played with Lego, about building the thing. I think a lot of kids today treat Lego kits like models, and they build them in 45 minutes or an hour, and they put them on their shelf and never use them again. I much prefer the idea that when you're finished with that thing that you're building, you break it apart and you do it again with some other new project. And that's what counseling is like for me. The idea that we're going on a journey with somebody instead of just looking at the photo album of the journey that we've already had. Enjoy being in that process instead of trying to rush through it. And accept that you are probably going to have to be a humble person. You're not going to get it always right. You're going to stumble over words. You're going to sometimes say the wrong thing. You're going to make mistakes, and be okay with that. And often that will give people permission to do the same thing with you. If you're a little bit vulnerable and a little bit imperfect, that's okay. I don't think you need to try and pretend like you are somehow omniscient or godlike. That is just not something that is realistic or relatable for people. So this is another outcome that we want of the self-analysis. Really thinking about where you want to grow as a person, even if you cannot see exactly how that's going to translate to the work you do in counseling or community support work. Trust me, it does. When you start working on yourself, you become a person who's more equipped to help others.